Fucking Spyro, am I right? Look, I'm not here to wax poetic about how nostalgic I am for the original trilogy, though I might not be able to help doing that just a little later on. Nor am I here to speculate uselessly about Reignited. Discussion of that game is best saved for after it's out. At the moment, in this context, Reignited is just an excuse to do something I've always wanted to do. Since Spyro is now topical, I'm here to do a thorough retrospective on the original Spyro trilogy. And I want to do this now because, well, being relevant means views. But aside from that, the existence of Reignited means that soon, there will be no definitive version of the original Spyro trilogy. Reignited will have its changes, some good, some bad. Arguments will inevitably arise about which version of the trilogy is better, and unless Toys for Bob really messes it up, there will be no right answer. So before any of that goes down, while I still have the opportunity, I want to examine the original trilogy as it stands on its own. I'm going to be going through each game in order, covering as many topics as I can find something interesting to say about, while tracking how things changed over the course of the trilogy. I'll be going through each game from their respective starts, covering them beginning to end, and using parts of each game as jumping off points for stuff I want to talk about. I'll avoid mentioning the existence of every level in a blind pursuit of being thorough, but where there's something to say, it shall be said. This is gonna be a long one, folks. I hope you're ready. There'll be timestamps in the description in case you want to leave and come back. I know not everyone has time to sit through something like this in one go. Without further ado, let's dive straight into the first game in the trilogy, Spyro the Dragon. Spyro the Dragon, being the first of the trilogy, stands out as being definitely the first. As in, Insomniac didn't quite have everything figured out just yet. Though this game establishes a lot of great things, it doesn't hit everything out of the park. As we go on, we'll see that the sequels by and large improve on what was established in the first game, but before we examine the improvements, we first have to establish the baseline. Let me confess up front that this game has always been my least favorite of the original trilogy, but replaying it for this video, I did find things to appreciate that I had previously not noticed or entirely forgotten. This is a great game, just not my favorite. That said, let's get into the particulars by first jumping into the opening cutscene, and oh, the roughness is immediately apparent. The opening cutscene alone establishes several elements that would be ironed out in the sequels. The first of these elements is the presentation of the story. These being early PlayStation games, the story wasn't important, which I'm okay with. For these games, all that really matters is that the game's fun to play. Stories in these games are only ever secondary at best. That being said, though this story neither makes nor breaks the game, the presentation of said story, being as muddled as it is, only works to the game's detriment. So let's play it out for a bit and see if we can't decipher what's going on.
What about this Gnasty Gnorc character?
I'll take that question. Nasty Gnorc is a simple creature.
Simple?
He has been contained in a remote world and is no threat to the Dragon Kingdom. No threat! Besides, he is ugly. Ugly? That does it!
Looks like I've got some things to do.
Okay, so, what? I can grasp the most basic intent here, that being that the dragons shit-talk Gnasty Gnorc, so he gets mad and turns them all to crystal, but, how did any of that happen? From these shots, we can tell that the dragons and Gnasty are in two separate locations. This raises a question: how the hell is he hearing anything the dragons are saying? The cutscene opens with a script and a boom mic, but nowhere do we see a camera, and there's no camera to be found anywhere after the cutscene ends, and nowhere in Gnasty's lair is there a TV or anything, so there's no way he could be watching whatever this is supposed to be, unless, of course, you want to say it's all
magic. Well, that's just lazy writing.
Basically, this cutscene happens so fast and explains so little as to leave me befuddled. Part of me wants to believe that this confusing presentation, and setting the scene up as an interview whose legitimacy is questionable at best, is a deliberate rebuke of the idea that games are supposed to have a coherent narrative that acts as anything more than basic motivation for the player, but the scene is too fast and confusing for me to really buy into that idea. There isn't much else in the way of story throughout the rest of the game. There's a victory cutscene after beating Gnasty Gnorc, and a bonus one for getting 100%, and that's pretty much it. From this, I gather that story was not at all a priority during the game's development, which, again, is absolutely fine. I don't need narrative twists and turns to keep me engaged in a 3D platforming collectathon. I just need to be having fun doing the platforming and collecting. I just wish what story there was a little more coherent is all. Confusion aside, the narrative structure is fairly simple. Villain does bad, Spyro goes to undo the bad, and then he does. We'll see how future games expanded the role of the story when we get to them, from fleshing out the simple structure of the first game to adding side characters with their own arcs. For now, I still have some more things about the opening of the first game to address, namely, this.
What about Nasty Newark? Nasty Newark.
Ganasty, Gnork.
Nasty Newark.
Ganasty, Gnork.
Nasty Newark.
So now that we've finally gotten past everything I can extrapolate from the opening cutscene, we can move on to the gameplay introduction. This game opens by dropping you straight into the first hub world. Doing this allows the player to come to grips with how the game plays before putting any skills into practice within an actual level. You've got space to run around in and get used to the movement, and you've got enemies who don't attack you so you can safely test out your own attacks. It's an approach that doesn't hold your hand, which I can appreciate. A downside of this approach, though, is that it risks leaving players feeling directionless and purposeless. You've got the vague goals of freeing dragons and beating Ganasty Gnork, but outside of that, you're just in this big open area with multiple paths out and levels to tackle and no set order to do anything in, and you're just like, what do I do? Where do I go?
What?
It's up to you to figure out that you can do whatever level you want in whatever order you choose, and if you don't figure that out soon, you might feel a little overwhelmed. That said, the chances of players actually getting lost and confused are slim at best. It's just worth acknowledging the possibility for future reference. While we're running around in the hub world, I must mention that the controls feel ever so slightly janky. Movement is just a hair too floaty, especially when turning while running, and you can't jump all that much while running. The camera does this weird thing where it grinds to a halt whenever Spyro smashes into a wall and bounces back, which is quite disorienting. Basically, the game feel is rough around the edges. Thankfully, future installments do go on to tighten the controls, which I'll cover when we get there. I only bring this all up because I'm the kind of guy who's very picky about how it feels to control a character. Awkward movement can absolutely ruin an otherwise okay game for me. For a great game like this, it just make it a little less inviting. I can't blame this game's controls for not being as good as what came after, but that doesn't mean I have to enjoy them. Transitioning into the first level and to a note of positivity, this game does one really cool thing that the sequels oddly drop: seamless level transitions. Here, take a look. You hop into a level portal, the camera pans onto Spyro, a little loading happens, and then whoosh, Spyro lands right in the level, with no cuts or loading screens or anything. Not only is this cool from a technical perspective, but it lends all these disparate fantasy worlds the tiniest sense of cohesion. Instead of just being random portals to wherever, these seamless transitions make you feel like you're going somewhere at least somewhat connected to where you were. In future installments, the screen will fade a couple of times, and Spyro will just sort of be somewhere. And now, a message from our sponsors.
And now we're back to How Did I Get Here? The only show that makes you ask yourself, how did I get here? Here's our first person.
Oh my god! How did I get here? Hello? How did I get here? Somebody help me, please!
Rather than landing in a random place and not knowing where the hell you are, in the first game, you get to see the whole journey, from entrance to landing, and thus, everything feels just a little bit more natural. Anyway, now that we've landed in the first level, Stone Hills, let's talk about the general level design trends of this game. Like the hub world, this level features a more open design. It dumps you into the middle of a field, and from there you can explore different paths until you find everything and/or go away. This design gives you a lot to explore, and the freedom to explore it as you please, again, acclimating players to the whole moving around in 3D space thing. And perhaps that was its purpose, because once that purpose was filled, this open design went right out the window. In general, most of the levels in this game follow a more linear structure. Linear in the sense that they're about getting from point A to point B with few or no deviations in between those points. To be fair, this A to B structure applies to most levels throughout the whole trilogy, but future games will have more clever ways to break up or remix that structure, while this first game mostly sticks to it. The dominant trick this game uses to break up the structure is with side paths, like this little area over here in Alpine Ridge. That's not all to say that this first game doesn't experiment with those level structures, of course. Quite the opposite, some of the best and worst levels are ones whose designs are a bit more experimental, but we'll cover those later. For now, I want to address why these levels tended to be linear. See, a lot of early 3D games couldn't actually display a lot of 3D space due to hardware limitations. Games like Silent Hill would cover this up by covering everything in fog. The developers behind Spyro, though, wanted to have a big 3D world that was always visible, no fog or anything. So that's what they did.
I had this idea that you could do a panoramic 3D engine on the Sony PlayStation, where there wouldn't be any fog in the distance. And I challenged Alex Hastings to create such an engine.
Most of what it takes to pull off that sort of panoramic engine, it comes around in, assembly draw routines.
Because not only did you have these big, long views where anything in the universe could be seen from afar, but also he created an engine where you could have detail on the objects that were close.
In a way, I can see how this then new technology would lend itself to a more linear design, being able to see a goal off in the distance and always know what you're working toward and how to get there. I just wish other sorts of design paradigms, be it open or what have you, weren't restricted to stone hills and the hub worlds. The later games will have more in the way of interesting level design and increasingly clever ways to use 3D space, but for now we're stuck with this, so we'll have to deal with it. To be clear, I'm not trying to say the linear structure of these levels is bad. On the contrary, I think it worked to this game's benefit. After all, this sort of level design is simple to make and easy to understand. Because when this game did experiment with non-linear design, well, it didn't always work out so well. The clearest example of this has to do with gem collecting. Being a collectathon, gem collecting should ideally be fun, right? At the very least, not frustrating to complete. But pair gem collecting with funky design, and frustration is exactly what you get. In Stone Hills, for instance, given its relatively open design, the gems are naturally scattered all over the place, meaning that some of them are hidden in really out-of-the-way places that even thorough explorers might overlook by chance. This means getting lost and confused, wondering where the hell those last gems are, and being lost and confused is never fun. Thus, collecting gems in this level ain't fun. But Stone Hills isn't the most egregious example of poor gem placement, oh no. For that, we have to skip ahead to Cliff Town. Though this level is more or less linear, it does at least try to get clever with how it layers some ground and rooftop sections and a cliff. But it's with this attempted cleverness that the gem placement becomes just about infuriating. So check it. The last gems I had to get in the level were these ones behind the starting building. However, before I ever thought to check back behind there, the game more or less told me not to. Look here, from the high area from which you are meant to fly behind the building, if you walk too far in the direction of said building, an invisible barrier pushes you back. Now, what is the function of any barrier in any game? To prevent the player from going forward, right? To tell them, stop, there's nothing here, go somewhere else. Well, I did go somewhere else. I dicked around in the rest of the level for a good 10 minutes before giving it up and looking it up. This is hands down the worst gem placement in the whole trilogy. I can't fathom how one is supposed to find these on their own when the game is saying to look elsewhere. On top of that, placement like this negates the fun of gem collection. Usually, you take a bit of time, scour out the level, pick up everything you find, and once that number hits its maximum, you get a brief moment of satisfaction. But the longer you spend searching for just a few gems, the more frustration builds. As a result, when I finally got those last gems, I wasn't satisfied, just thankful it was over. Between the questionable gem placement in Cliff Town and Stone Hills and the general linearity of the rest of the levels, we can see that this game was very much a first step with Insomniac figuring out how to design 3D levels. They would, of course, improve with later games, but that doesn't mean this game didn't have cool innovations of its own that aren't worthy of some praise. Most notably, one of the few levels that strayed from this linear design format is actually one of my favorites, Dry Canyon. This level subtly encourages players to memorize the 3D layout of the level, and from that, extrapolate new paths that would have been impossible in 2D. At some point in the level, you're introduced to the concept that there are some high-up places that you can only reach by gliding to from higher points. With this knowledge in hand, you'll glide around, find places, and eventually reach the end of the level. But look off to the side and, hey, there's one more dragon to free. But wait, I can't quite reach. How the hell do I get up there? This is where the game tests you on how well you've memorized the 3D layout of the level. If you explored thoroughly earlier, you would have flown into this cave that led to a high-up outcrop. Having gotten your gems, you probably left it, thinking that was it. From up there, you couldn't see anything else. But having now reached the end of the level, if you think about where that outcrop is relative to the last dragon, you should be able to realize that gliding from that outcrop is how you reach the last dragon. Congratulations, player! You have successfully oriented yourself in navigating 3D space, and the game is rewarding you for doing so, which always feels nice. This sort of design, one that loops back on itself and asks the player to memorize its layered space, doesn't recur that much in this game, but will become more common in the next two games. Another cool thing that this game got right the first time was the design philosophy behind the enemies, and to showcase that, we're going to mosey on over to another level of the first hub world, Dark Hollow. Though on the whole Dark Hollow is too short and simple a level to be otherwise noteworthy, it does do a good job of showcasing this game's enemy types. Enemies in this game are either big or small and armored or not armored. Big enemies you can only defeat by flaming, armored by charging. If they're both armored and big, oh good. This trend is established here and remains ubiquitous throughout the trilogy, and it does so because of how effective it is in communicating to players everything they need to know about an enemy. With just a glance at any enemy, a player can instantly read how to dispatch them, and when there's a group, they can plan knowing each enemy's weakness. The enemies being easily readable allows players to quickly react to any situation, keeping the pacing of enemy encounters fast and fun. Good on Insomniac to hit this one out of the park first try, and keeping it consistent throughout the series. Though I must mention, there's one big exception to this game's generally good sense of enemy design: the bosses. I'm going to hit up the boss of the first hub world to show you what I mean. His name's Toasty, and I'm gonna let the fight, as it were, play out.
Be careful, Spyro. This boss has many tricks up his sleeve.
Right, so, Insomniac, quick question. Where was the boss? I jest, of course, but honestly, I wouldn't blame anyone for not noticing that this guy was a boss. Hell, I'm not even sure I knew this was a boss until I replayed this game for this video, so let's back up a bit and ask ourselves. In general, what makes a good video game boss? Rhetorical question! Obviously, everyone will have different answers to this question, and any answer I give will inevitably be constructed so that I can apply it to Toasty here to show you how he's not a good boss. You can go look up some video essay on YouTube if you actually care about the topic. Anyway, the two general indicators of a good boss fight I'm making up with the purpose of making Toasty look bad are as follows. 1, a challenge, and 2, a test of skills learned in-game. These points tie into each other, but bear with me. Point 1 differentiates a boss from other enemies within their own game, while point 2 differentiates a boss from bosses of other games and gives the boss a sense of purpose within its own game. When a boss is challenging, it acts as the climax to a level or world or what have you. Being more difficult than a standard enemy, a boss forces a player to give it their undivided attention and dedicate more time and energy to it. Due to this extra effort required on the player's part, overcoming a boss thus brings with it a sense of satisfaction. This ties into point 2. Ideally, a boss should test the skills that a player has learned within the game. By applying the skills they learned in new and more challenging ways, a player is able to feel like they attained a sort of mastery over a game, playing into that sense of satisfaction. With all that in mind, let's apply those points to Toasty here. Does Toasty provide a challenge? Well, does he test any skills you learned through playing that are unique to this game? Sure, you have to flame him to beat him, but that's no more or less challenging than any other enemy in the game. The only difference here is that Toasty takes 3 hits, but given how unlikely it is that you'll be damaged, I'd be hard-pressed to say that this is testing your ability to flame good. I mean, you saw how easily I walked through that whole fight, right? There was no fight! Without any challenge or reasonable test of your skills, Toasty is not satisfying to overcome, and thus fails as a boss. Unfortunately, that applies to the rest of the bosses in this game, including Gnasty Gnorc. With the exception of that one random big robot, who's kind of challenging, I guess, none of the other bosses either challenge you or provide a decent test of your skills, and all are unsatisfying. I mean, you know it's a bad sign when the regular enemies within boss levels are more memorable than the bosses themselves.
It was at this moment he knew. He fucked up.
With the general failure of this game's bosses, I started floating a few questions in my head, namely why and how, and I think I've got, if not answers, at least a few points to make. First, to answer why they failed on the second metric, I must point out that this game is not combat-centric. Shocking, I know. Though there is fighting, it's not exactly a fleshed-out combat system. It's more there to keep things lively, while you do the whole running around and collecting thing. Without any central combat mechanics, there are no real skills that the bosses can test you on. The only really fleshed out mechanic that qualifies as a testable skill is supercharging, which we'll get more in-depth into later. Suffice to say, despite how fleshed out it is, this skill was never put to the test in a boss fight. Why that was is anyone's guess, be it technical limitations or they were trying to focus on it as an exploration skill. In any case, the bosses could never test you on anything, which really hurt their chances of ever being wholly satisfying. They could have, however, been challenging, but weren't, for some reason. Why this is, I don't know. I could hazard a guess that these bosses weren't challenging due to Insomniac's relative inexperience with designing 3D bosses. Indeed, as the games go on, the bosses do get progressively more challenging, which one might attribute to the development team's experience. Regardless of future accomplishments, though, the fact remains that these bosses were a disappointment. They didn't test any meaningful skills, they weren't challenging, and most damning of all, they weren't satisfying to overcome. And all of that makes me wonder, if they couldn't make the boss fights fun, why bother including them at all? Games don't inherently need bosses to be fun after all, but they're such a staple that I can't help but think they were included just to have them. What sort of game doesn't have bosses after all? In attempting to shoehorn in something that the game didn't need, Insomniac ended up wasting efforts on parts of the game that could have been cut for the better. A darn shame that, but at least they learned from their mistake and got better. I realize after that whole tangent there, it might be sounding like I hate this game and want to tear it down or something, but I assure you that's not the case. In a game full of first tries, there's bound to be some stumbles, but with every stumble comes a pickup. That is to say, something very, very right. To get to the big right thing, we're going to have to jump into the third hub world, but while we're here I might as well mention the fact that the hub world themselves are an element that this game nailed. They're all pretty cool. With the exception of the first and last one, the hub worlds are all themselves basically their own levels, featuring enemies, hazardous platforming, and their own unique mechanics. The second one had these war cannons, this one has magic, and another one has shape-shifting enemies. Having these sorts of obstacles in between levels makes the walks between them that much more engaging. The best part about hub worlds being levels, though, is that they can introduce mechanics that are then fleshed out in the levels. By introducing a base form of a mechanic in a relatively safe space, aka the hub world, players can get used to the mechanic before the mechanic is then expanded upon within a level. For instance, this hub world introduces the wizards that move land. In the hub world, they're just sort of irritating to deal with, putting up little walls that you can easily circumvent. In the first level of this hub world, though, Alpine Ridge, the mechanic is fleshed out. Now the wizards messing up the land pose a serious threat to your traversal, requiring more thought on your part to overcome these obstacles. Another example of hub worlds introducing mechanics is in Dreamweavers, which introduces these shape-shifting enemies, followed by almost every level in that world having its own unique spin on the concept. But it's in using the hub worlds to introduce new mechanics that we find one of my newfound favorite aspects of this game that I really wanted to discuss here: supercharging. Fuck yeah! Being the other mechanic introduced in the third hub world, the supercharge is put to immediate use and is iterated upon throughout the game, becoming increasingly complex and more satisfying to use each time. Smartly, its introduction in the hub world is required. You have to use it to get past a bit of ground before it's magicked into the air, forcing players to become familiar with the concept of going fast before having to supercharge within levels. Within the levels themselves, the first utilization of supercharging is relatively straightforward, as it should be, but even here it has its little nuances. The first level supercharging is used in High Caves is accessible right away, where the hub world introduces the supercharge by having you only do one thing with it, that being charging into a wizard before he can block your path with a magic wall. High Caves has you using it to do two things: jump to reach inaccessible areas, and, optionally, kill otherwise invulnerable enemies. The latter option I'm especially fond of. This level starts by giving you two paths forward: the normal way, and the shortcut filled with super deadly invincible bug things. You could try your luck with the bugs, and honestly, you could probably just run right past them, but they will give you a hard time, so working your way through the level and being able to pay back the bugs that gave you trouble earlier is rather rewarding. But don't let the charge jumping escape your notice. This is its own sort of mechanic within a mechanic that's introduced here and taken to greater heights later. Haha. The concept here is fairly simple. You see a place you can't reach, you see a ramp, and you know you can go fast. Put two and two together, and yeah, big jumps. And just in case that concept wasn't clear here, it's reintroduced and expanded upon in the very next level, Wizard Peak. This level 2 has you charging down a ramp to jump to another part of the level. This level changes up that concept slightly, and you have to figure out the change for yourself. If you just try the standard charge and jump, you won't make it, as you don't have enough speed. You have to think back into the level and realize that there are multiple ramps you can charge down before jumping, thus granting you enough speed. The level then immediately challenges you to reapply this concept in a more difficult manner, ensuring that you'll remember it. Over here there's a ramp to jump from, but it's quite a distance from the other ramps you charge down from. You have to realize that you can maintain your charge while turning, and then you have to actually be able to do it, which is no small feat. Once you have, though, you'll have this second escalation internalized. You can chain charges to get more jump. So here's our path so far. A simple introduction, followed by an immediate usage that builds on the concept, followed by another iteration that again escalates the challenge while teaching you more about how the mechanic works. So what is all of this building to? Well, the next hub world, Beastmakers, houses one of my new favorite levels of the trilogy, Treetops. And it's this level that makes the fullest, most satisfying use of the supercharge, acting as the climax to this little narrative that we've built from this mechanic. I was stuck on Treetops for a good 20 minutes figuring out how to use the supercharge to get this level's most hidden collectibles. And if that isn't indicative of this level taking supercharging to its mechanical limits, then I don't know what is. For completion, this level tasks you with combining everything you've learned about supercharging, adds the twist of having to jump between ramps, and has you employ your memorization of 3D space skills a la Dry Canyon. By asking you to employ all these different skills, completing this level winds up being one of the most trying and satisfying in the whole game. So there we have our whole arc of the supercharge, from a simple introduction to a complex finale. It does see two other uses after this, one of which is almost as cool as Treetops, but this alone is a great example of challenging the player by slowly upping the complexity of a mechanic. The end result of a few levels of learning is a climactic and satisfying escalation that was well worth the wait. And while that was the best example in the first game of this sort of challenge escalation, it's thankfully not the only one. The obvious other example of challenge escalation within this game comes in the form of the speedways, which get harder as they go. They are a unique challenge that offer a break from the platforming collecting action by having you fly around and figure out how to do so in a timely manner. Each new speedway becomes gradually more complex until you accidentally become a master of flight through the process of figuring out the most efficient way to navigate the courses. They're a fun distraction that becomes a series staple, but they're not what I want to focus on. What I really want to talk about in relation to escalating challenge is the enemies. I talked earlier about how the enemies adhere to a particular design paradigm. Big or not, armored or not, you remember that. That does hold true throughout the game, but if enemies were just that, they'd get stagnant after a while. Insomniac managed to counter that stagnation by basically throwing in a whole lot of enemy gimmicks, which worked splendidly. After getting used to the main enemy design paradigm in the first hub world, many subsequent levels and future hub worlds have unique gimmicks to pile on top of the core design to keep you on your toes. I've already mentioned how enemies in Dreamweavers transform, but there are more examples besides that. Back in Terrace Village, the first level of Beastmakers, there are these enemies that periodically electrocute the floor, forcing you to be mindful of when you attack them. Speaking of Beastmakers, in general, that was a rather deadly world. In Misty Bog in particular, I was regularly taking hits. That level had unusually aggressive enemies, like these very fast bushes and very erratic frogs, both of which require extreme caution on the player's part. And then the level will just put you in a room with a butt ton of enemies, and it's like, how is anyone supposed to get out of that unscathed? Hint. They're not. And I can't not mention the final normal level in the last hub world, Twilight Harbor of Ganasty's world. What makes these enemies so noteworthy is that they've got fucking guns and grenades! Jesus Christ, what the fuck? I thought this was a kid's game! In all seriousness, the gun toters are difficult to manage due to their spray pattern bullets that can be tricky to dodge once fired. As for the grenadiers, I'm gonna call BS on these guys, because if you're anywhere near where they're aiming when they throw their grenades, you're taking damage. The damage radius on those things and their speed are a little much for our poor dragon friend to dodge. I don't like them. Placed together, these enemies make for the toughest combat gauntlet in the game, a fitting high point for the last level. Through all of that, you can see how the enemies were made to almost constantly keep players on their toes. While I can't say they were all the most challenging to overcome, though some really tested me, I can applaud the variety of designs that emerged from the core design paradigm, which kept me constantly engaged throughout the game. Speaking of the end of the game, I've just about said my piece on this one. All we've left to cover is the end. After the lackluster final confrontation with Ganasty Gnorc, provided that you've gotten all the collectibles up until this point, you unlock the bonus level Ganasty's Loot, which I never played before. The point of this bonus level is to pat you on the back for getting all the things by showering you with even more things. You get to revel in the pure catharsis that is the sound of all those gems entering your pocket. It's an admittedly shallow reward, though it is pleasant while it lasts. I think the real reward here, though, is the cutscene where Spyro wears sunglasses like a bro. The next two games will have more elaborate and rewarding bonus levels and completion bonuses, and we'll see exactly how when we get to them. So that's Spyro 1. Overall, it's a fun game with cool style. It's notable for its impressive then new technology used to create big 3D levels that you could see a lot of. Though future games would put this tech to better use with more smartly designed levels, the initial outing was no slouch. For a first outing, it does a lot of things right. Its ability to smartly pace out a challenge throughout itself comes to mind. The enemy design was top tier, it had a pleasant atmosphere, and it was generally fun to play. As for what it doesn't do well, such as the bosses, well, that's what the sequels are for. So let's talk about those.
This is where the fun begins.
Okay, so I've got some biases I should admit up front, all of which can be summed up as, to me, this game is Spyro. On top of being the first Spyro game I played, Ripto's Rage was one of the first games I ever owned. This game was an experience that defined my perception of both Spyro the character and Spyro the game franchise, in addition to probably shaping my tastes in and habits of gaming for the rest of my days. So, yeah, kind of a big deal to me. Like I said earlier, I don't want to get too caught up in an overly sentimental recital of why childhood was grand or anything. Just, if I seem less critical of this game than I ought to be, you know why. Well, that's just one reason. The second reason I might, will, be less critical is that this game is genuinely great. It's an almost perfect sequel. Just about everything the previous game did right, this one kept. Everything the last game didn't do right was either discarded or improved upon in this one, and best of all, this one had its own unique additions that would help set it apart and elevate it from its predecessor. For further details, please stick around. This is Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage. The opening of Ripto's Rage is a vast improvement on the opening of the first game. This game presents a more coherent story, a more fun and diverse cast of characters, and a better introduction to the gameplay. Let's start with the story and characters. The opening cutscene of Ripto's Rage is markedly longer than that of the first game, but I can forgive that because it has much more going on and is much more entertaining. This cutscene firmly establishes a fun tone, the world and its inhabitants, and, most of all, makes sense. The first big thing of note is that the villain is actually in the same geographic location as everyone else, so his interacting with the rest of the cast makes sense. And as long as I'm talking about Ripto here, this cutscene alone gives him much more character than anything attributed to Gnasty Gnorc throughout the whole first game. In actuality, Ripto doesn't have much more going on personality-wise than Gnasty Gnorc, and he's just as static. However, merely being able to interact with the other characters, both for comedy and to try to be threatening, makes him seem like, you know, an actual character instead of just the bad guy. In fact, the same could be said for the rest of the cast. Instead of a bunch of random dragons who talk to Spyro once and then disappear into the ether forever, we have an established cast of characters who interact and have chemistry with one another. Though a mere few minutes in length, the opening cutscene efficiently uses its time to establish each character and their relationships, implying a long history that lends an extra layer of believability to the whole thing. With just one line, the scrappy young dragon from the first game is redefined as the cool guy that I have always had as my mental image of him.
You're a dragon?
You got a problem with that, pussycat?
What's new, pussycat? Whoa, whoa, whoa!
With one facial expression, Hunter's scaredy cat nature and his respect for Laura is established, and by respect I mean fear. And my favorite bit, the same scene that introduces Ripto as the scary big bad immediately undermines any sense of threat that might have otherwise come from him. This is all fairly amusing, much more so than anything in the last game, and it all helps to establish this game's more fun tone. Where the first game was a fairly straightforward adventure with a bad guy to take down, this one has the attitude of, yeah, we know how this is gonna go down, so why don't we all just chill and have a good time? And that's an attitude to live by. The opening level's pretty chill too. First thing I gotta mention is the slight improvements to the controls. Everything's less floaty now, your turns are tighter, you can actually jump while running, and the camera doesn't freeze when you smack into a wall. Overall, the controls are just a little tighter, but that little bit makes all the difference in the world to me. Being more fun to control, even just slightly, makes me more likely to want to return to this game than the last one. Standing in stark contrast to the first game, which dropped you into a hub world at the start, Ripto's Rage plunges you straight into a level. Though this opening level does ultimately teach players about the game in a manner similar to that of the first game, I argue that this game's approach is more effective. For instance, starting in a hub world in the last game gave you space to figure out what this whole moving in 3D thing was. The start of this open level is a similarly open space, just with a bit more to do. You're given space to figure out what's what, and sprinkled within this space are some of the basic elements of the game you need to be familiar with. There's the gems, which are fairly self-explanatory, and the enemies. The first enemies you encounter are these these blue guys who don't really attack you, so they're there to allow you to figure out how you can attack, namely by flaming and charging. The clever bit here is how the big enemies are introduced. See, there's only one in this open area toward the back of it. Say this is your first Spyro game, like it was mine. You've figured out that you can defeat enemies by charging at them thanks to these blue guys, so you start running through the level and this guy comes up. No problem, you think you'll just keep charging and be good, right? Wrong. And then, out of panic or consciously trying the one other attack you know, you shoot out your flames and he's taken care of. And now you know how to deal with big enemies. From there you can intuit that you need to be on the lookout for enemies that can only be killed in specific ways, and this is all in the first 5 minutes. Cutscene and everything. Another way opening in a level like this is better for the player is that there's much less room to get lost. In the first game, dumping you straight into a hub world with multiple paths to take and levels to choose from ran the risk of confusing or otherwise overwhelming the player. In this game though, not so much. Though the first area is wide and allows players to experiment, ultimately, there's only one path forward that every player will have to eventually go through, ensuring that every player sees and learns everything they need to from this level. Speaking of, the next thing players will learn just down that path is the name of their new arch nemesis, Moneybags. Now that we've stumbled upon this guy, I'm going to take this opportunity to jump around a little and talk in general about how this game handles collectibles, both in comparison to the last game and on its own terms. See, Moneybags here is a recurring roadblock. You can't get past him until you pay him a certain amount of gems. You know, the main collectible. His character gives form to a mechanic that was a tad more abstracted in the first game. In that game, you needed to pick up a certain number of gems to access the next hub world, on top of rescuing the dragons. Why? No real reason, and just from going through the levels, naturally you were likely to have enough by the time you tried to go to the next world and not even realize that this mechanic was a thing. I sure didn't. Ripto's Rage, though, gives you a more tangible reason behind this mechanic, because this guy's a greedy asshole.
And he needs money!
And unlike the last game, you actually lose the treasure when you pay the guy. So instead of an arbitrary wall of have this much stuff, by actually paying a fee to a character, these paywalls are that much more tangible, thus encouraging you to actually collect the stuff. Let's elaborate on that a bit. Moneybags' presence encourages the player to explore and pick up gems. Instead of a single non-paywall being tossed at the end of every hub world, Moneybags is sprinkled throughout every level. You never know when he's going to show up or what his fee is going to be. Thus, in order to avoid the headache of not being able to pay Moneybags, the player will naturally develop the habit of hunting and picking up as many gems as possible, basically tricking players into thoroughly exploring levels, which is neato. I must also say that the mere act of collecting gems is much more satisfying this time around, simply due to how they sound. The volume's been boosted significantly, from the buzz of sparks grabbing a gem to the sparkly sound effect when you pick up a gem. Every instance of gem collection sounds sharp and good. With how satisfying it is to pick up these gems, you almost didn't even need Moneybags. Just let me pick up these things and listen to them all day. That's good enough for me. And gems aren't the only collectible. You've also got these orb things needed for various tasks and talismans at the end of every level that are required to unlock the next hub world. In contrast to the previous game, every collectible feels purposeful. The most important collectibles, the dragons, were easy enough to understand, but the gems were just there, and the eggs, I mean, did you even realize you needed those? I didn't, I just picked them up and immediately forgot about them. Apart from the dragons, it's hard to care about the collectibles in the first game because they don't leave any impact, and the game never makes them feel important. Not true for Ripto's Rage. Every collectible feels distinct and purposeful. We've already discussed the gems. The added presence of Moneybags makes it feel like those shiny things could come in handy at any time. Gathering all the talismans is something you do just by playing the game through. They're simply an indicator that you beat a level, but still, while their singular purpose and virtual guarantee of being picked up makes them feel ironically less special, a mark of accomplishment is better than, give me an egg. But the orbs are where it's at. These are rewards for clearing certain optional tasks, and they unlock levels and the final boss. In other words, the act of getting them itself is fun, and getting them rewards you with more fun. These are the tangible effects that were lacking from the first game. You're incentivized to get each collectible, and each has its own reward. Therefore, you're more likely to go after them, and thus further engage with and explore the game. Alright, tangent over, back to the level 1 cave with Moneybags. Take note of this ladder over here to the right, we'll come back to that later, but for now, we pay off the greedy bastard, cross the bridge, and hey, it's the end of the level. I imagine many first-time players will get to the end of the level and think, cool, that's it. But wait, this level still got a little left to teach. Instead of exiting the level, if you engage your curiosity a little and turn around, you'll find a little path hidden from sight unless you specifically turn around to look for it. And what does this path lead to but more level? This here is rewarding players for slowing down, not rushing out, and exploring a bit, and teaching them that if they keep their eyes open, they can find more stuff in each level than there initially appears to be. Unlike Spyro 1, here, the end is rarely ever the end. There's always more to do. The back part of the opening level serves to acquaint the player with two new prominent aspects of Ripto's Rage: side missions and power-ups. Both are cool features. The side missions lend variety to each level beyond jump here and flame that guy, and the power-ups add some spice to the player's usual movement and attack options. Handily, there's both one standalone side mission and a side mission that utilizes one of these new power-ups, so both concepts are thoroughly yet efficiently introduced. Power-ups in this game are granted by passing through these gates that are unlocked after defeating a certain number of enemies in a level, giving your average player more incentive to go after enemies than just they drop gems. The first power-up grants you temporary flight, which, fuck yeah, you fly around, light up lamps, and land riding a high. That was cool, and you want to do it again. Then, all of a sudden, flashback. Back in the cave, there was the ladder you couldn't climb, and this guy told you to come back later when you could climb ladders, so you're like, okay, whatever. But when you step back just a little, you can see what's on top of the ladder, and it's one of those power-up gates. And around the cave are lamps, just like the ones outside. So you realize if you come back later when you can climb ladders, you can do the flying thing! Ah! In one fell swoop, the game has both taught you that you'll be returning to levels later to do things you couldn't before, and given you reason to want to do so. Now that's a clever bit of design trickery right there. So that's all of the first level. I realize that was a lot I went over with a couple of tangents thrown in, so let's recap. The first level was overall a much stronger introduction to its game than the opener of Spyro 1, where that game just gave you a confusing cutscene, plopped you into the middle of a big hub world, and let you stumble around until you figured shit out. This game's opening is much more coherent. It presented a coherent story with more well-defined characters, it explicitly taught players its basic rules, and it even concisely introduced a whole bunch of new stuff. There was so much good teaching stuff packed into that first level that isn't condescendingly handholdy, that this level alone makes this game feel much more inviting to new players than its predecessor, and the game's better off for it. And we haven't even started talking about the main game yet. Not everything within the game proper is as compact as that first level, and indeed, there's at least one element that's an outright downgrade from the previous game, but still, this game has enough cool shit in it that we're going to be here for a while yet. So now that we're out of the first level and in the first hub world, I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss a new design trend: progress gating. If there's a technical term for this, I don't know it, but basically what I mean by progress gating is the game restricting you from going somewhere until you clear certain conditions. That's probably a common enough occurrence in games that it doesn't require its own term, but I bring it up here because it was surprisingly uncommon in the last game, and is much more so here. The only occurrences of progress gating in the last game were you couldn't go to the next hub world until you got a certain number of collectibles, and one level that had you rescuing fairies in various levels, and that's it. You probably never even noticed it. You were otherwise free to explore the levels however you chose. That does not hold true for Ripto's Rage. This game has a lot more in the way of progress gating. This can be seen very soon into the first hub world with the second appearance of Moneybags. Moneybags' fee here is required to learn how to swim, which will in turn unlock access to the rest of this hub world. But in order to collect enough gems to pay him, you have to first visit at least one, but probably both, of the two levels available to you right now. In other words, by gaining your access to the rest of the world, the game is forcing you to engage with its introductory levels, as opposed to letting you roam free. But most of the examples of this game's progress gating occur within levels. These are smaller gates, generally repeated throughout a level, with the goal of forcing you to explore a level and/or engage the enemies. In Idle Springs, for example, one of the first levels, you have to defeat these thingies so that NPCs they were harassing are free and able to unlock the next part of the level for you. There are more examples of this than I can reasonably run through. Like, there's Hurricos, where you have to pick up these bulbs guarded by enemies to power down actual gates. There's Crystal Glacier, where you have to free little dudes so they can make a path for you, and I could go on, but you get the point. The frequency of these sorts of progress gates throughout the game reflects a desire on the developer's part to have players experience more of the game. At least that's how I like to interpret this. Given that their presence forces further engagement, I can't think of any other potential intended reason for their presence, and I think these gates are successful beyond those literal effects. Having these gates present gives players many any quick goals to work toward, which may be more engaging for some than simply being dropped in a level and saying go. Simply put, these progress gates are just another way of getting players invested, and they do their job well. Speaking of keeping players invested, I'd like to now discuss another of this game's new elements, side missions. We briefly touched on them earlier, but now is the time for elaboration. This game is absolutely littered with side missions. Each level has a few, and most feature mechanics or gameplay styles unique to that mission. Idle Springs, for instance, has fishing and odd puzzles. Colossus, the other of the first few levels, has ice hockey, which is the worst, but that's neither here or there. Sunny Beach has a strangely morbid mission, where if you fail, baby turtles get cooked into soup, and so on for every level. These side missions being so unique from each other and being so frequent serves one primary function. They add a lot of variety to the gameplay. Where the first game was just platforming and collecting the whole way through, and some speedways, this one uses the side missions to break up that base gameplay in order to prevent it from getting boring. After all, it's much easier to get excited about a new level when you have no idea what it's going to have you do. Of course, that's all helped when the side missions themselves are fun. The best side missions in this game engage the player by challenging them and or giving them new powers to play with. There's this one late game mission in Cloud Temples that lets you play around with Ice Breath, which is cool because freezing enemies changes how you traverse the land in which you use it. Another of the better side missions is this massive trade-a-thon in Mystic Marsh, which challenges the player's ability to explore and understand the level's layout and its surroundings. Side missions like these keep the player engaged by giving them new things to do and actively challenging their understanding of the level around them, all of which helps to keep things from getting boring. Sadly, not all side missions are created equal. There are some not-so-fun ones which do hamper the overall experience. There is, of course, the aforementioned ice hockey, which commits the ultimate gaming sin of controlling like ass. You should know this about me by now. If I don't feel like I'm in control, and I don't have a damn good reason not to be, then I'm not having fun. Guess what? I don't feel like I'm in control during ice hockey, and therefore I don't have fun with it. But at least that side mission bothers to challenge you, even if the challenge does stem from nonsense. There are, somehow, side missions even worse than that. The one that pops into mind for me is this one in Crystal Glacier, where you follow a snow leopard for a bit, and that's it. No, seriously, all you do is follow it, feed it a little fish, and then you're done. There's no enemies to fight, no challenge or tension or anything. It's just busy work, and that's no fun. So between the boring side missions and those with bad controls, while they do add a lot of variety in and of itself isn't necessarily an improvement, especially when said variety means adding stuff to do that is markedly less interesting than the base gameplay. The biggest problem with the sheer breadth of side missions, I think, is that there's too many. The game seems to be in such a hurry to pump out new ideas that it never lingers on any. As soon as a mechanic is introduced, it gets thrown out in favor of a new one, never to be seen again or expanded upon. While this does mean there's new stuff around every corner, none of it ever has any chance to be more than skin deep. Because these new mechanics and playstyles only ever pop up once, there's no real opportunity for the developers to iterate upon and flesh out those ideas, and no opportunity for players to play enough of them to achieve any sort of mastery. The supercharging mechanic in the first game was great because it did do all of that. It was repeatedly used throughout the game, becoming slightly more complicated with each iteration, and requiring the player to learn from each iteration until they achieved mastery over the mechanic. But that could never happen in Ripto's Rage. It's all one and done. Again, I appreciate the variety these side missions bring to the table. I just wish any mechanic within them had a chance to be something more substantial. Oh, and lest I forget, the inclusion of these side missions did result in the creation of a collective trauma of our childhoods.
Trouble with the trolley. Trouble with the trolley.
Trouble with the trolley.
And now for something completely different.
You'll recall my spiel about the relatively straightforward level design of the first game, excepting the occasional smart use of 3D space. Well, good news! Things just got a lot more interesting. This game has smarter ways to design for 3D space, so let's take a look at a few examples, starting with one of the earliest levels, Idle Springs. At first, Idle Springs seems fairly standard. You beat some enemies, unlock a door, and move on. Quite straightforward. But even from the start, this level was teasing you with something more. If you were paying attention at the start, you might have noticed this shiny metal box thing. You couldn't reach it, so you're forced to move on, but you never forget it. You get to the end, But instead of just leaving, if you've learned your lesson from the first level, you head off to a side path. You find yourself gliding over platforms and, wait a minute, that's the rest of the level down there. And when you keep going, you find a rocket which you light and it blows up a metal container over the way. This is the start of the level.
Wow.
What's going on here is you're backtracking through the level, but above it. Here, the developers have used 3D space to layer multiple paths on top of each other, and used these layered paths to have the level loop back on itself. This is both efficient use of 3D space, allowing the developers to cram more stuff into a smaller area, and a way to reward players for thoroughly exploring the level. And that's not the only example of a level that truly takes advantage of the fact that we're in 3D. Hurricos pulls off a similar stunt as Idle Springs, layering 2 paths on top of each other, though in this instance the top layer is a tough platforming challenge. Skelos Badlands loops back on itself in proper circular fashion. Fracture Hills separates its top and bottom layers into equally open paths that take a while to explore. Magma Cone has you climbing a volcano, and thus is built vertically rather than horizontally. The end point of Shady Oasis is just about on top of the start point. In general, that level has you looping all over the place as you ascend. I could go on, but you get the idea. This game has a lot more in the way of experimenting with 3D level design. The less rigidly structured design of a lot of these levels keeps the moment-to-moment level exploration much more interesting than in the first game. Where in the first game almost every level was a straightforward point A to point B sort of deal, levels in this game may turn you around or task you with shooting birds or any number of unpredictable things. That's it, really. These levels are much more unpredictable, and in turn are much more fun to play and explore. I've got one more element I want to mention that's an explicit improvement over its counterpart in the first game, the boss battles. Granted, the 2 essential elements of a boss fight I outlined earlier still don't apply here. Though these bosses are slightly more challenging than those in the first game, they still aren't difficult by any stretch of the imagination, and they don't do much to test any skills you learned in-game either. What these guys got right that the previous game didn't is presentation. Thanks to the setting and context behind these fights, they at least feel like boss fights. Or in the first game, you would just play through a normal level and then chase some guy for a bit. Here, each boss has story context and boss arenas and unique attack patterns that you have to learn, and health bars even. True, in the end, those are all just decorations that disguise fights that amount to almost useless distractions, which serve little functional purpose other than progressing the story, I guess. But even that's more than we got in the first game, so though they're still not great, I can at least appreciate these bosses. And hey, the story cutscenes we got out of the bosses were cute, so there's that. Like the one where Ripto tries to feed your fairy friend to Gulp.
Fairy lives don't matter today.
Oh, speaking of, that's another thing I wanted to discuss. Story and cutscenes. A lot of this game's charm comes from its cutscenes, which are symptoms of this game's sudden spike in its ability to tell stories. Mind you, I'm not talking about the overarching plot of the whole game. That's just there. It gets you from point A to point B on top of being somewhat amusing. What I'm talking about is the little stories that Insomniac managed to weave into each and every level that are all charming and fun, and I love it. So, here's how they did that. New and unique to this game, every level opens with a short cutscene that features the NPCs of the level and sets up the level's overarching conflict. Every level also ends with a cutscene that is either a resolution to or postscript of that conflict. These conflicts are usually quite simple, all having no dialogue and most featuring something like the NPCs being terrorized by that level's enemies, but their simplicity is part of the charm. Take good old Idle Springs, for instance. Opens with NPCs being terrorized by tikis, ends with this. Aww. Magma Cone introduces the volcano problem with, oh god!
He's freaking gone.
And when everything's fine, they celebrate, and oh god! There's the cutscenes in Metropolis, where it opens with an NPC waiting to cross the road while introducing one of the enemies, and then it ends with, you know, this game's a lot more morbid than I remember. But you get the idea. These cutscenes give each level a lot more personality. The little stories they tell keep you thinking about them long after you finished playing, and for that reason they deserve some recognition. But I ain't done yet. Beyond the start and end cutscenes, the dialogues and little events within the levels also tell little stories. These are similarly simple and cute, like Crystal Glacier, for instance. At the start of the level, one of the NPCs says this:
Spyro, the ice wizards have imprisoned our leader, Shaman Tuck. Can you help us rescue him? It is urgent. He has our tickets to tonight's hockey game in Colossus Valley.
So there's your whole motivation. Get these guys them ticks. And when you get to the end of the level...
Here, take this crystal. I traded some hockey tickets for it.
Cute, right? See, these little stories didn't need to be here. After all, they weren't present in the last game, and their absence was not felt. But their being here adds just a little bit extra charm to each level and the characters within, and the levels are thus better off for having them. To reinforce this point, I'm going to give you one other example. Well, that's my outward justification anyway. Really, the next bit is just something I never noticed before I replayed this game for this video, and thought was really cool when I noticed it, and wanted to share, so check it. I'm going to tell you about two levels, Zephyr and Breeze Harbor, the former of which I have a lot of fond memories of due to it containing parts where you blast birds out of the sky with cannons.
Blow that piece of junk out of the sky!
Here's the setup for this level. There's a war going on between some big bird people and these slime things. In this level, you aid the slimes as they fend off the birds. Also, there's a Romeo and Juliet thing happening between a slime and a bird, but all that matters for our purposes is the war. Now, when I describe the setup of Breeze Harbor, you'll probably fairly quickly understand what's going on. Just keep in mind that for an 8 or so year old playing these levels days apart, those sorts of connections weren't very easy to make, and I never had a reason to think on it further. So, in Breeze Harbor, you help these slightly different looking bird people fighting against slightly different looking blob things. But what was really going on didn't hit me until the end of the level, when the bird person said,
"Thanks for getting our ship fired up, Spyro. Now we can proceed with our counterattack on Zephyr. Counterattack on Zephyr.
Counterattack on Zephyr.
Spyro visited and aided both sides of a war. He played both sides just to get the collectibles he wanted. The sly bastard! So, aside from me being really proud of myself for making this obvious connection years later, I think that those levels are exemplary of the sort of storytelling that was absent from the first game. Nothing in your face, just enough details that if you pay attention and put the dots together, you get something useful, further rewarding players for engaging with the world. I've hit on most of the major points I wanted to, so let's start wrapping up by touching on the final boss. Ripto, as the final boss, is a complete departure from Gnasty Gnorc in every way. The differences start even before the respective fights. See, in the first game you had to beat the other two levels in Gnasty's world before you could fight Gnasty himself. In this game, though, you could theoretically skip all the levels in the last hub world, Winter Tundra, and head straight to Ripto, provided you had enough orbs. Though chances are, any player who's gotten to the last world with all those orbs is doing a completion run anyway and is not likely to skip any levels. It's nice that that can happen. Now, as for the fight itself, it's definitely the best boss fight in the series so far. Still not great, but then again, the bar for good in this context is really low, so I'll take what I can get. I wouldn't describe this fight as noticeably challenging, though it does require more effort from you than any of the other bosses so far, so there's that. But this boss, for once, actually does test skills you learned in-game, more so in the second stage than the first. The first stage is fine, more thematically appropriate than anything. You've been collecting orbs the whole game, and now you use those orbs to beat the crap out of the bad guys, so that's nice. The second phase is where it's at. All those few hours you spent grinding those speedways and using them fireballs finally come to fruition as you have to combine them both to take Ripto down, as in you're finally being tested on skills you learned. The game did prep you for this a level earlier, and now all you've got to do is prove yourself. Booyah. Thanks to kind of filling out those two checkboxes, this boss was easily the most satisfying to overcome yet. Congratulations, you win. But wait, we've still got one more point to cover, the completion bonus. Where the last game was content to just shower you with gems in a bonus level, this one goes one step further. You don't need 100% completion to access the equivalent bonus level here, this one filled with minigames, but you do need 100% to open the last door, giving you the permanent super fireball power-up. And I do mean permanent. You can carry it around to all previous levels and into a new game, adding on a little more replay value. That alone makes it a cooler reward than the previous game's shower of gems, though both would have been nice. And that's Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. In many ways, though not all, it's an improvement over the last game. The level design started to take advantage of its 3D nature, the controls were ever so slightly tighter, the characters were more fleshed out and amusing, the bosses were better, and its tone was more consistently chill and relaxed. All the extra side missions added a ton of variety to the game, though they were a roulette wheel of quality, and came at the cost of being able to really flesh out a mechanic. Overall, though, I love this game to death, and I mean literally to death. I somehow lost my game disc years ago, and I've never stopped feeling sad about that. But yeah, overall an improvement. Will the last game in the trilogy live up to the high expectations set by this game and the last? Let's find out. Spyro Year of the Dragon is something of a culmination of the previous two games. It takes and expands on elements of both to deliver the most extensive Spyro experience. Though this game's additions are few, they are welcome. We'll see various examples of both new and old elements as we make our way through the game. For now, let's start at the start. The game's opener, both the introductory cutscene and the first gameplay segment, is about on par with that of the previous game. The cutscene is slightly stronger, and the gameplay opener is arguably less effective. Starting with the cutscene, this one's only 2.5 minutes long, a decent step down from Ripto's over 3. Neither are as tight as the first game's single-minute opener, but these ones have a lot more going on. This game's opening cutscene does everything Ripto's does in a shorter amount of time, meaning you're getting the same thing out of it while getting to the action quicker. This opening cutscene also introduces this game's two main villains, one of which is the best in the series, and the other of which is at least better than Gnasty Gnorc, so I'd say that averages out to the best villains in the series right there. The lesser of the two is the main baddie, the Sorceress, who just sits back and lets her minions do all the work. Where Gnasty Gnorc froze all the dragons himself, and Ripto was at least there, the Sorceress is fairly removed from everything. However, her evil plan is still pulled off, and unlike the last two, she doesn't make a complete fool of herself, so I think we can call it even. Plus, her ultimate evil plan is more than a little messed up, so she's got that going for her. The second, air quotes, villain introduced is one of the minions doing all the legwork for the Sorceress, Bianca. Bianca is the best side character in all of Spyro because, unlike literally every other character, Bianca has a character arc. Whoa! What an unexpected development! We'll delve more into Bianca later. For now, back to the opening. After the cutscene, the game starts proper by dumping you straight into a hub world a la Spyro 1, and rushes to immediately get you acquainted with the dragon collectibles, though this time they're cute little babies and therefore superior. But more like Ripto's Rage, the design of this first area is a lot more straightforward. A slightly big area followed by a narrow path meant to guide you easily to the first goal, in this case, the first portal. On the one hand, dumping the player into a hub world allows them to come to grips with the gameplay and mechanics on their own terms, and pointing them straight at a level prevents players from getting lost or confused. After all, even if they decide to skip it for now, being forced to walk by it means they'll always know where it is. On the other hand, the tightness of the opener of Ripto's Rage is lost. That first level taught you most of what you needed to know about the game. After this opener, you'll just know the controls and collectibles maybe. Which approach you prefer may be up to personal preference, but for my money, Ripto's Rage nailed it. Anyway, the first level, Sunny Villa, is illustrative of this game's refined approach to 3D level design. These levels make good use of 3D space from almost the get-go. For instance, there are areas you can only get to by ascending and backtracking while ascended. Most importantly though, this level and most others in this game loop back on themselves. And by most, I mean the only ones I can think of that don't are ones where you don't play as Spyro. Seriously, look, in Sunny Villa, this door at the start is closed, but at the end you open it and it leads straight to the exit and a side mission. In Seashell Shore, your goal is to break NPCs out of a prison you spawn in front of, and you do so by working your way behind it and smashing through. The end of Icy Peak gives you a lift to the start. Bamboo Terrace literally bridges the start and near end. I could go on, but you get it. This sort of design is cool because it allows the developers to maximize their use of 3D space, thus potentially reducing file size on top of encouraging replayability. Instead of constructing a long, narrow path that takes up a lot of horizontal space while still requiring a decent amount of width, that path can be instead folded on itself, merging the width into one area and allowing players to more quickly access any part of the level. So, neato there. So now that we've established this game's general level design paradigm, we can see how the series' approach to 3D level design has evolved over the course of its run. Basically, it got cooler as it went on. What started out as a way to show off new tech by relying on mostly straightforward design turned into clever utilization of 3D space through the use of layering pathways and a looping structure. This last game, by building and expanding upon the foundations laid by the first two games, ended up presenting the best designed set of levels in the whole trilogy, and that's worthy of celebrations. While we're in the first level, let's talk about the return of side missions. Just like in Ripto's Rage, there's a whole bunch of extra missions in every level that give you stuff. But here, these side missions are a little more refined, and we can see the seed of this improvement planted right at the start when we hit up the skate park.
It's radical!
Full disclosure, I probably spent more time here as a kid than anyone was expected to, or reasonably should. Something about the novelty of a dragon riding a skateboard just clicked with me, I guess. Even going back to it today, it's still fun. It's simplistic, sure, this ain't no Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but executing all these crazy flips in a timely fashion while not screwing up still requires some level of finesse. What's important about this skateboarding, though, is that it isn't just a one-off thing like Ripto's Rage loved to do. Instead, like the supercharging of the first game, the skateboarding is brought back repeatedly, each time just a little more challenging, until its final usage really tests your skateboarding might. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say the skateboarding is nearly as robust or satisfying a mechanic as a supercharging. After all, every instance of skateboarding is divorced from the main level it's attached to, whereas the supercharged was integrated into several of the first game's levels. On top of that, the later instances of supercharging were much more challenging than anything the skateboarding segments ever managed, but still, putting in the effort to flesh out a new mechanic like this is something that was sorely lacking from Ripto's Rage, and I'm glad this new feature, and more, had more uses throughout the game, as opposed to being introduced and abandoned. Speaking of new features that see repeated use, just outside the first level is the first of the most important of these, segments where Moneybags gets the shit kicked out of him.
No hard feelings, eh?
Right. After all, I'm just doing my job.
Oh, also there's extra playable characters, first of which is Sheila here. I view these new playable characters as an extension of the whole side mission thing. With the new characters, though, these missions are able to have a sort of connecting through line. No longer are you bombarded with endless, random, disconnected missions that all play different and have nothing to do with each other. Now, in some of these missions, you'll be playing as a recurring character with new gameplay mechanics that carry over mission to mission, giving you a chance to learn and get good at each new style of play. Granted, none of these new playstyles are as fleshed out as Spyro's base gameplay, none of them sport Spyro's versatility, but still, overall it's nice that this game doesn't throw random minigames at you for the sake of variety, rather fleshing out a few new ones so that they don't feel disconnected and bad. Not all of the new characters are created equal, some are more fun than others, but they're still an overall good addition to the game. There are 4 in total: Sheila, Sergeant Bird, Bentley, and Agent 9. Let's go over all of them right now, shall we? See how they play and how they contribute to this game's fun factor. Sheila is first up. Everyone's favorite kangaroo. The relative power she wields, combined with her pleasant, nonchalant attitude, makes every bit of dialogue she gets a joy to take in.
I mean, they say this world used to have magic coming out the wazoo.
Gameplay-wise, she's pretty alright too. Her base movement speed is faster than Spyro's, which is nice. She can double jump really high, and most importantly, kick hard. It's her kick that I really like. Something about that kick just packs a real punch, you know? Taking down enemies is satisfying when you're smacking them that hard. Sheila doesn't have fire breath or the ability to glide, but her own attacks and movement options are different enough to keep her levels fresh. Next up is Sergeant Bird. Sadly, that cutscene is the most joy I take from this character. Conceptually, he's really cool, being a little penguin that flies around and drops bombs on everything, but in execution he's stiff. His ground movement is intentionally so, in order to encourage the player to fly around everywhere, problem being that the flying isn't much better. Turning in the air is still a slow process. Sure, you can bomb dudes, but only after performing the necessary calculations to make sure your relative height and velocity perfectly align so that the bomb's trajectory when dropped doesn't cause it to miss your target. Remember, restrictive controls aren't inherently a bad thing, but in the case of Sergeant Bird's flying, they do nothing but hamper the experience. Perhaps this can be chalked up to trying to do too much when 3D movement was still limited to a D-pad, but still, these controls don't hold up very well today. The third character is Bentley.
Now hold on!
One more, perhaps? At least.
He's the simplest of the bunch. You walk, you smash, and, that's it. Despite his simplistic gameplay, Bentley is elevated simply by the rule of cool. Sure, just walking around and hitting things doesn't give you a lot to work with gameplay-wise, but look, you're a Yeti with a big stick. A really big stick. How could you not love that? Plus, though simple, the act of smashing things is uber satisfying enough on its own, much like Sheila's kick, and the levels are short enough that playing as Bentley never has a chance to get old. He's simple and fun, and that's all you really need. The last new character is Agent 9, and boy howdy is he cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
Oh, say, you ever see a bear dance?
No.
Well, it's your lucky day. Check this out.
No!
faster, isn't he? Not much stamina, though. Too bad I had a lot more ammo left.
This guy's so fun. I think I love him. His character, anyway. Gameplay's a little more of a mixed bag. What's interesting about him is that each level of his sports a different gameplay style. The first is a third-person shooter, then you've got a top-down shooter, then a Doom-esque first-person shooter, and then an on-rails first-person shooter. Cool that you've got all that variety packed into one character, but as a result, no single playstyle of Agent 9's is fleshed out enough to warrant more than one go. They're fun maybe once, but any closer look will start to reveal more annoyances, like the fixed throwing arc on these grenades. There's no good way to aim them, you just have to toss and pray, or how the aiming reticle in the on-rail shooter might be too slow in some situations. Small annoyances like that are only exacerbated on repeat playthroughs. It's cool that Agent 9's levels are so varied, I just wish they had any polish. While all the gameplay of all the side characters can be accused of being relatively simplistic, they were never boring. Agent 9, in concept and in personality, is never boring, but his gameplay sure leaves a lot to be desired. Agent 9 may be the last new character, but he's not the last character with his own levels. You didn't think I forgot about Sparks, did you? I realize I haven't had much a chance to talk about Sparks throughout this whole video, but that's just because there's not all that much to talk about. Though he's been your constant companion throughout the whole journey, his only function has been as a health indicator, and grabbing gems. Up until this game, he never even got any dialogue. Basically, I've never had cause to bring him up, until now, because it's only now that he's getting something to do. Sparks' levels in this game are cool for two reasons. One, it's just a nice gesture. Despite my lack of mentioning him, Sparks has always been an important companion. He's a staple that everyone appreciates, so giving him his own levels is like returning the favor, giving us even more reason to care about him. Second, his levels are actually fun. Like every other extra character, Sparks' gameplay isn't as fleshed out as Spyro's, but being the brief distraction that it is, I think it received more than its fair share of attention. These levels are simple but effective top-down shooters. The controls, though somewhat restrictive, are actually fairly smooth. Thus, I can enjoy the challenge that arises from successfully navigating this character. The various power-ups, on top of being eye candy, keep the base gameplay of move and shoot quick and exciting, and these levels can actually be somewhat challenging. These levels are a welcome change of pace from the main game, and I'm glad our boy Sparks got some more attention. And those are all the side characters. Despite a few stumbles, overall their levels add a lot of much-needed variety to the gameplay beyond simply having Spyro flame fish. Each character is distinct enough from Spyro in terms of personality and gameplay so as to feel wholly fresh. You wouldn't want any of them heading up their own game, but they're good to take a break with every once in a while. But enough about those distractions from the main game. Let's talk about bosses. Wait, those are also distractions. I'm happy to report that this game's set of bosses is the best of the original trilogy. The bosses in this game are, for the most part, not piss easy, and they do occasionally test skills you learn throughout the game. The first boss, for instance, I actually died to. Don't judge me. The final boss has you riding around in vehicles, which you occasionally did throughout the game. Most of all these bosses, unlike past bosses, were satisfying to defeat. Beating them actually felt like overcoming a relatively large obstacle. Another cool aspect of each of these fights is that they all incorporate each ally you rescued in each hub world. Basically, these bosses act as proper climaxes to their respective areas. They may not be the best bosses in all of gaming, no, but they're the best the series ever got, so I'm happy to recognize them for that. There is one rather odd boss I can't go without mentioning though, and it's this guy. Despite still being better than any boss from the other games, this guy features the one major design flaw and or glitch present in any boss in the series. Context. You have two ways of damaging this guy. Shooting one slow-moving green rocket, or rapid-fire shooting a bunch of small red rockets. You would think the red rockets would do less damage than the green rockets, but, they don't. While this is a pretty glaring oversight, the fight overall is still fine. I just thought this was an interesting tidbit. Another thing this game did better than the rest was its storytelling. Overall, that is. There's two aspects to this game's storytelling that I want to discuss. The little story is told on a level-by-level basis, aka world building, and the game's overarching plot, aka Bianca rules. On the world building front, I would rank this game slightly below Ripto's Rage, though only slightly. The one major difference of note here is the lack of cutscenes at the start and end of each level. On the one hand, this omission is good for gameplay. Instead of forcing players to be inactive for a brief period of time every time they start and end a level, players get to jump right into and out of levels, speeding up the pace of the action. On the other hand, this omission not only reduces the charm and general fun of each level's little story, but it reduces overall storytelling potential. The dynamic nature of the cutscenes, being able to animate characters beyond idle talking animations and running from place to place, meant that these cutscenes could communicate a lot more visually. They could show you a tiki coming in to roast a marshmallow or horrible relentless murder. Without that, all you're left with is a lot of dialogue. being told what the story is instead of seeing or experiencing it. To be fair, these levels can still tell a simple A to B plot, or be otherwise charming. Break my friends out of prison is all well and good, and I can't help but smirk at the level where everyone speaks in haiku. All I'm saying is that there's a level of depth absent here that the previous game nailed. This game did nail one thing that the last didn't, though, and that's in the overarching plot, and by that I mostly mean Bianca's great. That's this game's big advantage over the last two. It has a character with any semblance of emotional depth that develops over the course of the game. Neither of the other games had anything like that, and because this game does, and because your actions are somewhat responsible for Bianca's growth, it feels like your actions have meaning and consequences beyond collect the things and beat the bad guy. Not only are you saving the day, but you're also saving one person in particular. Well, to be more precise, you're helping her to save herself. And you get to watch that saving play out beat by beat, which is rewarding in and of itself. So let's track how Bianca changed throughout the game. At the start, we simply know her as the sorceress's apprentice. She does all the dirty work, setting herself up as an antagonist. We only get hints that her relationship with the sorceress isn't stable, which will become more obvious as events play out. Her first confrontation with Spyro is, well, confrontational. She has not a kind word to say. She threatens Spyro and leaves, not giving us much reason to care about her. A couple of levels into the first hub world, a cutscene plays in which Bianca tries to warn off Spyro and hunt her before attacking. The takeaway here is that Bianca, despite working for the big bad, is not quick to violence. She looked for another solution before resorting to it. This shows a willingness to consider things from the perspective of others, despite ostensibly being a villain. The sorceress sure wouldn't do that. In fact, the next cutscene, right before the boss, shows her hurling verbal abuse at Bianca.
Listen carefully, you stupid girl.
Who displays reluctance when ordered to outright kill Spyro.
Eliminate him. Kill him?
This is where the seed of doubt is planted in Bianca's mind. Maybe the sorceress isn't all she thinks she is. In the next Bianca cutscene, oh Jesus. Rated E for everyone. Despite the gross nature of that, this scene actually serves to water that seed that was just planted. Bianca was just saved by the two she thought to be her enemies. If they saved her just because, surely they couldn't be as bad as the sorceress says. Before, she delivered warnings out of the goodness of her heart. Now she has genuine reason to care about at least one of these two. Due to this growing doubt, the next time she questions the sorceress, she does so out loud, to her face. It's a clear display of a changing heart, driven home by the fact that she starts calling Hunter and Spyro by their names afterward. That shows that she cares about their well-being, and is starting to recognize that what she's doing might be hurting people. Once the sorceress confirms that that is indeed the case, Bianca won't stand for it.
Smash them and crush them and grind them and tear them! Oh, yes! Smear them and smoosh them and crack them and crease them! But, won't that kill them?
Bianca was only ever a naive but well-meaning apprentice who wanted to save her world's magic, a pawn tricked into doing the baddie's bidding. Once all of that becomes clear, Bianca takes the one path she knows is right, saving her new friends and saving the world.
You're terrible! I can't believe I ever listened to you! Spyro, I know you don't trust me, but I want to help you stop the sorceress.
So that's Bianca. So what does it matter that Bianca is an actual character? Aside from making her actions feel more meaningful, which is a bit nebulous, I admit, functionally, Bianca's growth helps to keep the game's pacing on track. As you progress through the game, so too does Bianca progress with her thought process. Her change gives you a more tangible sense of progress with each step. It's a small effect, but it's helpful. And now, a couple of minor points before moving on to the end. One about collectibles, and one about, weird shit. First, about collectibles. Year of the Dragon utilizes its collectibles more efficiently than the previous two games, and it does that by focusing on what's important. The previous games each had 3 sets of collectibles, and trying to stretch out the functions between the 3 left some of them feeling purposeless. While Ripto's rage was stronger than the first game on this front, the talismans couldn't help but feel like one-trick ponies. Year of the Dragon smartly does away with any third set of collectibles, and instead focuses on just 2. Gems, scattered everywhere for easy pickings, and Dragon Eggs, a singular reward for completing important tasks, such as beating a level or a side mission. Both are required to unlock some parts of the game, thus neither feel purposeless and are always rewarding to collect. The second thing I want to talk about doesn't really contribute to any big point, and I couldn't really fit it in anywhere. I just wanted to mention the fact that there's a level with dinosaur cowboys. Holy shit, how has no one ever thought of this? This is amazing. I suppose I could say that this level, this concept, is yet another example of these games' boundless creativity, from sheep riding UFOs to all-out war between bird and slime and all things dinosaur. But really, I just wanted to impress on you, this shit's fucking cool. All that said, it's time to discuss the end game.
Mwah.
It's a sad sight, Sparks. Another noble warrior falls victim to the plague of love.
After beating the sorceress, you get not one but 2 endgame bonus rewards, one for simply beating the game, and another for completion. The former of those is the finale to the Let's Beat the Shit Out of Moneybag saga.
Revenge! 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 Revenge!
The completion bonus is equally grand. Back to Spyro 1 form, the completion bonus is a whole new level, but unlike that instance which essentially just threw a bunch of money at you, here you actually have stuff to do. Basically, it brings back all your favorite mechanics, new and old, and goes nuts with them. Thieves? Check. Flying fireballs? Check. Skateboarding? Triple check. And of course, it drowns you in gems while you're at it. So where the first game just let you drown in gems, and the second game let you go nuts with fireballs, this one lets you do all of that and more. It's the best of both worlds, a statement which applies to this game as a whole. With elements pulled from both games and new additions of its own, Year of the Dragon feels like the biggest and most ambitious entry in the original Spyro trilogy, a fitting climax to end the series. So here we are at the end. Let's briefly recap what the trilogy did and how it evolved. What started as partially a way to show off cool new 3D graphics technology evolved into a game that took full advantage of being 3D. What started off as a concept for just one cool character morphed into having all the cool characters. Floaty controls got tightened, a straightforward collectathon platforming game added on increasing amounts of extra content, and despite some stumbles here and there, the games made sure fun was always the top priority. The greatness of these games, when put on a graph, was always on an upward trajectory, even if the slope was low. In other words, a great concept got better as it was iterated upon, leaving us with one of the most satisfying trilogies to ever grace our television screens. From the Gnorcs to the dinosaurs, flames to the skateboards, and everything in between, there's so much packed into these games that we're still talking about them 20 years later, and we'll definitely remember them for years to come. I love these games and always will, and hopefully, with this new resurgence of Spyro's popularity, we'll have many more fun adventures yet to come. Until then, I always have these childhood classics to go back to, games that are classics for all the right reasons. Now all we have to do is hope Reignited doesn't fuck it up. Wait, actually, that one's not too bad. Hey there, Tyranno here, jumping in at the end here just to say thanks for sitting through that giant-ass video of mine. I know not everyone is into the giant-ass videos. I am. God, it's really hard to believe that this whole project is over now. I've been working on this single video project longer than I have any other. The earliest file for this dates back to April, and it's November right now. And it's done. I've been going at this for so long. What am I going to do with myself now? I don't know. It's NaNoWriMo right now, so deep into that. Anyway, again, just wanted to say thanks for watching. Shout out to my friend Aaron Tempest for just giving this video a watch over. I was able to bounce a few ideas off him and tighten it up a little, make it slightly better than it was, so thanks for that. And then there's the like, share, subscribe. It makes me feel dirty to say that. I don't want to shove myself in your face too much, do all that self-promotion nonsense, because I don't care, but I've been working on this video so much that I kind of wanted to see it get a little attention, you know? Can you blame me? So I will do that one share thing. Share! But aside from that, feel free to... I just want to say thanks, really. Thanks for sitting through this. I've been working on it so long, and I'm happy that if you're listening to this right now, then you sat through it, and I'm happy that you did that. So, thanks for that, and I will see you later. Adios.